Hi, and welcome to another episode of Talking About Teaching Economics. My guest today, making her second wonderful appearance on the podcast, is Alison Coffin from Memorial University. Hi, Alison.
Hi.
So today we're going to be talking about fiscal policy. This is one of those really often politically charged topics and can get a lot of excitement in the classroom. And I think it gets delivered in a lot of different ways. You come at this, I suspect, from a slightly different angle than I do, having actually lived more of this than me. You've been inside the sausage factory. When you approach this topic in the classroom, what's your outcome that you're looking for?
Oh my, that's a tricky question because you want students to have a really good knowledge of how government works. You also have a good knowledge of the mechanics of economics. And those two things don't necessarily coincide in a really nice, simple way, right? We like to draw a graph and say, hey, this is how things move, and this is how we reach an equilibrium, and it captures everything. And you look at government, and government is a convoluted and complex situation that has a time factor to it that is slightly different than most other things. So trying to meld the two is really, really So I find one of the first things you kind of need to do is let's talk about what government does and how do you understand where government is, and let's try and build on what their knowledge already is.
Okay. So you almost start from a civics platform.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's a neat idea. I'd never thought about doing it that way. I tend to come at it more from the straight ahead economics side, which is interesting. Well, which begs one of the big questions I wanted to kick around with you, because of where you're coming from. In your experience in the real world, if we want to call it that, how much of provincial level spending actually meets the definition for fiscal policy?
Oh my goodness. Now you've asked a very hard question because I haven't looked at the accounts in that particular way.
Yeah.
In the Hubbard Child's book that you talk about fiscal policy as just being spending on economic conditions. And that's a slightly different take than some of the ways that I've looked at it in previous because for me, fiscal spending is any spending that government does. And so spending on the environment is going to maybe stimulate some environmental protection programs, which is going to go into consumers or into businesses, which is going to stimulate spending as well. So I think fiscal policy to me is government spending directed in a variety of different ways, because ultimately everything is about the economic health of a society, the socioeconomic health of a society. So they kind of go hand in glove as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, no, that's an interesting answer. I again on this, I think we've got a lot of room for debate, which will be fun. Perhaps we'll do one special on this.
I'll read some background material before then.
Yeah, well, again, it's one of those things. For me, I think the objective of healthcare spending is health, hopefully, and that's going to have some knock-on effects. But I'm not yet convinced that the framework that we're talking about in introductory level chapters on fiscal policy is the appropriate framework for analyzing health spending. It's that's sort of my take on it. But you're absolutely right that there are, hey, if we run a hospital in a small community, as Saskatchewan used to, then you're gonna have knock-on effects from those communities. So I think that's really important.
If you're spending on healthcare, you're spending on salaries for individuals, spending on materials and equipment, and you're spending money on capital expenditures. So or a new air ambulance or things like that. So it's not a direct going into consumers' pockets, like in that direct connection that we often see. Someone getting a new job in a rural community is a big jump in.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can see that ripple through Newfoundland and Labrador particularly well, right? Because we are so small.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and so I don't think we should be ignoring the knock-on effects, but I just think that's a really interesting question. So when you're doing fiscal policy, do you teach the multiplier explicitly?
Yes.
And which multiplier do you teach?
Oh my. We do the simple multiplier, and of course the government spending multiplier, tax multiplier, and then of course the complex multiplier.
The one with taxes and imports?
Taxes and imports as well, the whole thing. And so I've been using Reagan for a long time, and Reagan is quite a complex So that is a bit difficult for students to kind of understand. So I often simplify with, what is a multiplier? Well, just think about how many times your money gets spent through the economy. So I say things like, let's pretend you bought a house, and so you buy a house and that becomes income for someone else. So the contractor gets a pile of income. So you spend your money once, and then your contractor goes, oh, I've got more money, so I'm going to go out and buy a car. So that money gets respent again. And then the car dealership or the salesperson has more salary coming in because they earn money. And so that gets multiplied again. And so the students kind of get that, like, oh, right, that one spend multiplies and multiplies and multiplies through. So once you kind of make those connections, that really helps the larger concept. The math is a little bit trickier.
and moving up and down between the really simplistic multiplier and the more complex one is non-trivial. So am I getting the sense that maybe you teach the multiplier and some of this stuff as a leakages and injections space coming?
Yes, like that. Yeah, it's when I talk about the multiplier, I say, let's look at what happens if we change taxes. Is there more money in your pocket, or is there less money in your pocket? If there's more money in your pocket, then it's going to multiply its way through. Right. So conceptually kind of makes sense. But then you talk about, well, if the tax rate goes up, so you were being taxed at 10%, and then you're being taxed at 35%, which is a horrible jump. If that's the case, then there's substantially less money in your pocket, so you can't spend as much, and that gets passed on as well. So yeah. So conceptually it makes a lot of sense, but again, that getting that absolute number is really hard. And quite often I say the multiplier is 1/1 minus whatever number you find in front of y.
No, that's a great simplification and a great reduction. But no, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, what else did I want to have here? So do you come at this? How do you build to this topic when you're thinking about it in terms of economics? I agree with you. The civics piece of it is so important.
Yeah.
And understanding the distinction between the model and what's happening in your local legislative assembly. So how do you build to this? Where do you start?
Okay, quite often when I move from the intro, micro, macro chapters into, now we're talking about macroeconomics. So how does a macroeconomic model work? What does it look like? Who's interacting and in what markets? I break out the color, and I have so much fun drawing a crazy circular flow diagram. Right. And in response to the question, Miss, do we have to duplicate this on an exam? It's no. What you need to understand is, who are the agents interacting? And what markets are they interacting in? So once you understand kind of the relationships in each of the different markets, that really helps them get a sense of, a lot of the interrelationships come into play. So then we can say, well, look, this is how government works, and this is how government influences households or influences the different markets. And I like to frame that up, the larger picture of relationships. Say, okay, let's go unpack what's inside of government and how do they work in this relationship.
No, that's great. So a little bit more micro bridging perhaps than some people do. No, I think that's really, that's really interesting. And do you do the Keynes cross explicitly? Do you build that particular model, or no?
I do demand supply, aggregate supply models, yes. And again, I often, because I've been using Reagan a lot lately, I'll build in the way that Reagan builds, and was like, let's start with the basic model of households and consumers, and then build my demand from there. So that's kind of where I go with that. Okay,
so not explicitly Keynes cross, but more ADAS.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. And do you do dynamic or static ADAS?
A bit of both.
Yeah, I'd like the dynamic model. Because it makes it really clear, because one of the questions I've often gotten, I'm sure you've had, well, if we can find out where equilibrium is and where full employment is, why don't we just go there?
Oh yeah which makes a lot of sense, but oftentimes it depends on how well the students are getting the let's build it to the larger model, let's build it to the larger model. Sometimes you get to this point and you say, okay, I understand the one connect, but once you start making this thing triggers this thing, which triggers this thing, which triggers this thing, we sometimes will lose them along the way. And if your questioning it is going to be like a multiple choice type of question, or a reasonably like 1 or 2 step deductive question, I find adding too many of those steps in, some of the students who are marginal or who are they
Having a hard time.
they're not understanding it at super
Yeah.
level, right?
Yeah. Well, no, and that's always a question of balance, and how do you get through that,
Yeah.
and how much detail can you throw at them? And that's, that's one of the knocks against the dynamic model is, yeah, all these curves are moving. Oh, yeah, yeah.
You should see how many colors they break out for that.
Oh, I do the same thing, and it's all colors. So it's like, okay, and everything's got to be a shade of blue, right? So if I can find 3 different blue markers, I've got, right, okay, here's my
green and purple and red and black and so many.
Yeah.
One of my students
just
brought me in a whole highlighter set, right?
Nice. Yeah. No, and that's so important. And that's such a great teaching tip. And, like making things color coded in a fairly easy to follow way is so important.
Yeah.
So when you're delivering this,
Uh-huh.
do you focus on the long run equilibrium or the short run equilibrium?
Ooh, I do both.
Yeah, no, fair. But where do you think you spend more time?
Yeah, well, yeah, I try and, because we talk so much about the short run, the medium run, and the long run, the short run, the long run, the very long run in micro, and it has relevance that way. The same thing happens in macro as well. And I think there's a vast difference between the short run and macro for defining it as we're not in long run equilibrium. And then the long run is we're going to go away and come back, right? So the short run piece is really, really important for them to just understand what is equilibrium in any kind of macro model. If we're going to aggregate the entire economy, what does that look like? And then we can start thinking about, well, okay, if there's economic growth, or if we have a structural deficit, or if we have, like, once we start moving that production possibility boundary, how does that make all of the other pieces start to move as well, right? And the macro model wasn't bad enough.
Now we got to throw in this PPF thing.
Let's throw that one in too, right? So sometimes at the end of the semester, when everything seems good and the students have good clarity about things, at the end of the term, I'll often start pulling, well, remember when we talked about, the factors of production and how it built and then tie all of that together to, we've got long run growth, and this is what's happening to aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This is what's happening to, so they'll get that. And like, this is what happens when we're underneath a production possibility frontier and then recession, that, right? We have unemployment and those things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you do kind of package it all back up again. Yeah. Because I've had colleagues and I've talked to people who've spent a lot of time on the very short run equilibrium and the not really fussed about that long run aggregate supply curve. And I've had others who spend most of their time focused on the long run outcomes. And it's one of those things, I think the student experience radically changes.
Yes.
And I can find arguments for doing it all different ways.
And I think some of that really needs to be a bit subjective and in the moment. Are you getting this? How relevant is it? Discussions you had in the lead up to that, right?
Right.
Sometimes when I talk about the big issues in economics at the very beginning, where you're setting the context in which we do our analysis, when you talk about that, if you happen to have picked up a bunch of government related issues, like taxation that we've had, or government needs to intervene in a variety of different ways. And if those movements have come during the term, and we've kind of mentioned them along the term, it couches the concept of long run in I guess more tangible discussion. So you are alluding to this is something that happens, so you can kind of throw it in there as well, right? So again, you really need to kind of read your room, and how much time have you spent, and how easily the concept's been captured, and how
much time do I have left? And I like to talk about short run as the political horizon, and long run as an economic horizon.
I like that. That's actually a really, really good definition of it. I definitely allude to the difference between, say, economic well-being and political motivation.
But they're playing different games, and of course you're going to make moves that look silly if you're playing a different game. So when you're talking about this, do you focus more on the taxation or more on the spending side?
I tend to be a little bit more on spending side,
Mhm.
less on taxation side. Tax messes students up a little bit. Sometimes just that extra number in there is a little bit too much.
Mm.
But the general concept of, how does a tax affect your income,
Mm.
and a tax's motivation or an incentive is certainly captured there. But I do believe, I haven't taught in about 6 months now, so I'm just doing
Right.
but more fiscal policy as opposed to or more spending as opposed to the taxation side.
No, and I mean, the spending stuff is more fun and it gets better headlines. I mean, it's more in your face from a student's perspective, I think. But so, do you engage with sort of that supply side issue, that tax wedge, the attempts to influence the location of the aggregate supply curve?
No, I don't usually do much on that. I often find as we make our way through that, there's not a lot of coverage of long run aggregate supply and a lot of those influences. So
Mm-hmm.
don't tend to concentrate on it as
No, that's
much.
fair.
But now that you've brought it up, perhaps I need to.
Well, it's one of those open questions, and the effects. I mean, there's still. I mean, it's definitely an area where there's a lot more disagreement. I think in the halls of the economics department over the impact of these supply side issues.
Yeah.
And so I'm always curious to see, do you even touch on this at all? And a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
I at least mention it because it's out there, but yeah, it's messy.
Yeah. The messy stuff is maybe not as appropriate for interest. Right?
Yeah, you can
seminar classes where we really want to start a fight.
It's easier to get, it can be easy to get leave people stuck in the mud, which is not where you want to leave them. How much do you spend, if you're talking about spending, how much time or play do you give to the idea of crowding out?
Oh, very little. And usually kind of a glancing blow in that as well. When we talk a little bit about, the demand side causes a move and that causes wages to go up, and when wages go up, supply goes back down and all of that. So I do talk about how they bounce back and forth and how one thing will influence the other thing in that relationship. But the concept of crowding out, I don't go into a lot of detail.
Okay.
But more about just how one will influence the other, and then eventually they kind of settle on to this is the price at our long run equilibrium.
Right. This is the new level kind of thing.
This is the new level.
Yeah.
And we talk a little bit about the rationale why that's going to happen. Like, sometimes I find the concept of what a long run aggregate supply curve is and why it's horizontal is often difficult to explain to students, right? Yeah, and the way I talk about it is in ratios, right? So if it costs you $100 to make stuff, and you can sell them for $10 each, you decide you're going to make 50. So if you double everything, so it costs you $200 to make and you sell them for $20, then still make 50 because you're still, and so they kind of get that, but they're not really sure of a mechanism around it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I found a perfect way of describing that yet, so I'm looking for good advice on it.
Well, I mean, I'll add another wrinkle that I know causes students grief with the long run aggregate supply curve is sometimes we can be beyond it. You're pitching me this as a PPF. Right. And that's usually how I start to get to the long run aggregate supply curve. It's a PPF, right? We can make this much stuff. And but then we can get beyond it. And they're like, well, wait, hold on a second here. I've had students really kind of take me to task on that.
Okay. I have an answer for that.
I do too.
Okay. My example.
No, you go ahead. You go.
The most tangible example is the Newfoundland Labrador fishery of us operating well outside of production possibility frontier, right?
It's a sustainable part that's missing from the discussion.
That's it.
Yeah, we do the same thing.
Yeah, and so when you start talking about that, it's like, well, we keep taking fish out, but they weren't reproducing fast enough. They get it. But then I also talk about, you and I can work 40-hour work weeks, and that's a normal work week. And then sometimes, you have to do overtime because there's extra stuff that just needs to happen. So you can maybe work a 60-hour work week.
Yeah.
But if you did that for a prolonged period of time, you're going to wear out. That is not a sustainable.
You're going to die.
Yeah, yeah. And none of us want that, right? You're going to burn out,
No.
you're going to snap at the people around you, and you're just not
Yeah.
going to do well in the job. And the quality of life is so. So they understand that, right? Students really
Yeah.
get there are constraints on my life, and
Yeah.
this is how I can no longer continue
We
doing it.
can get out there for a little while, but yeah, it's going to bite you eventually. Yeah, and that's really the angle I take with it is that sort of um sustainable capacity, that
Yeah,
normal depreciation kind of angle. I talk about it in terms of capital. I talk about it a lot in terms of labor because they have
yeah,
way more experience with labor than they do with capital.
yes.
Um, do you use, and this is something I'm playing with, and I'll leave, this is, we can kick this around if you like. Do you use a linear short run aggregate supply curve or a non-linear short run aggregate supply curve?
I usually use linear uh,
Okay.
just because it's easier for the to shift. That's the only
Oh
reason.
yeah, no, and mechanically it's way easier. It's faster and simpler to draw. But again, I've been playing with a non-linear one
Oh,
that is very flat to the left of longer negative supply and becomes vertical shortly after we pass longer negative supply. So I think I'm riffing on some of, like, going back to general theory and
yeah,
Keynes and
yeah.
and him making this point that it really looks like prices are sticky in a downward direction, and I'm trying, and I don't know whether I've been successful. So you haven't, this isn't something you've played with
No,
before.
I haven't played with that at all. I think you're thinking about that on a level that I'm not, but that's good because this is why we have these conversations
Well,
because
yeah,
my
and you
God,
can go, no, yeah, you're crazy, that's too much, don't do that. uh
it's good, but is it appropriate for intro classes?
doesn't land, and I do most of the models with this linear, and this is just something I'm playing with, and it's like,
Yeah,
okay, why do we think that government spending is so much more beneficial here than here?
right,
and
right.
and playing with that sort of context is I don't know. I've had some luck, and I think I've also fallen flat on my face. So
Somewhere in there, there's a medium. There's going to be a happy medium.
yeah, and it may just be the group, right? And
Yeah,
your
yeah.
earlier comment is absolutely on point. Is you've got to read the room and know, whether or not you can push a little more, or whether or not that's just going to leave too many behind in the mud.
I have a trick for reading the room. I look at them and say, I can't tell what you're thinking. So nod and smile or shake your head and look panicked, and I'll work with that. And it works. They're like, oh yeah, we get it, miss, or oh no.
Oh no.
It works. It's very effective for me, right?
Yeah, I always tell them I can't tell the difference between I'm bored out of my mind and I don't get it. Right? They look the same to me. Right? So
Yeah.
you got to tell me, guys. Um, so having, I'm going to give you two questions to sort of wrap things up here.
Okay.
If you could put together a short macroeconomic course for incoming new MLAs, what would be in it?
Oh my. Okay, that's a really good question. I tell you, it kind of ties into when I first became elected as an MHA. That's what we have here in
Oh,
Newfoundland.
sorry.
It's okay, it's good. One of the first things I did was call up the Department of Finance and Economics and went, hi, can we have an overview of the economic conditions of the province? So it was not only an overview of what the financials look like, but what do our demographics look like? We have something called
Mm,
community accounts. What does that look like? What are the implications of it? What's our distribution of people around the province? What's our skill set?
mm,
What's our family composition? What's our reliance on government supports and things like that? So it really gives them a sense of what are the conditions in which we are applying the economic principles. Let's start with
mm,
that first, right? Something that doesn't really clearly exist in, I guess, in a lot of economic analysis and economic modeling on the province level is where is our long run aggregate supply chain? What does that look like, right?
good luck.
If you don't know what it is, then you're probably going to create a structural deficit or a structural, just a
Yeah.
surplus because you don't know what the target is you're hitting, right? So some of that stuff you need to get a clearer picture of what that is before you
Mhm.
messing with it along the way. So that is a really important thing. In terms of macro, I mean, you can, talking about what are the levers that you can use in terms of economic policy, right? Let's look at things that go beyond, say, GDP or a GPP and employment rates, and let's start talking about things like homelessness and access to food, and let's talk about quality of care in hospitals and public services. Let's talk about things like what Bhutan has, the gross national happiness.
The happiness, yeah.
Yeah, there's good and bad to all of these things. All are absolutely relevant when you are applying economic policy. And I fall firmly in the camp of it's not just economics, like society. So you have to measure, can you get a doctor? Do you have a sense that your democracy is a real democracy, or feel like you have a sway in voting and things like that?
Right.
Corruption in the police force. Do you feel safe in your homes? All of these things are macroeconomic issues that require fiscal spending. And your definition of it requires all of those things. So conceptually thinking about, well, what does our economy look like? What is our role in that economy, and what are we trying to achieve is really, really
right.
And I think that is something that's not well understood by most MHAs. And having been an MHA, I can say, I'm not sure if I still have a complete picture of it, but
that's fair.
I'm probably pretty well equipped, right?
Yeah, well, so this brings us to what I like to leave as the last word for everybody. Okay. What advice, and drawing on your experience inside and outside the classroom, what advice do you give to new instructors? Somebody who's coming at a macro course, who's going to deliver the chapter or chapters on fiscal policy for the first time ever. The ink might still be wet on the PhD, or they might not have defended yet. What advice are you going to give them?
Oh my, really good. I would say make it tangible for the people who are learning it. Fiscal policy is one of those things that not everyone can understand exactly what it is. So if you don't see how, let's say, changing a GST rebate or changing your tax rate, if you don't see yourself as being affected by that and the connections that it has in society, it's going to be really hard to have some sense of how do we roll that into that macro model, right? Because people and individuals can really relate to themselves as a consumer. And they can really kind of relate to themselves as labor, but as a functioning piece of government, and government is kind of this mysterious creature. There's lots of sound bites and tells you what the world looks like in press releases, but may not have a full idea of what the long run aggregate supply looks like, right? So you're going to have a whole lot more success with students who kind of have a better sense of what the system looks like and how it works. And then they can start to see the mechanics of, this is how the economic model works. I aggregate all of my individual demands up into this aggregate demand curve, and now it makes sense. So that's a trick for me. Other than that, the multiplier is 1/1 minus the thing in front of y.
That's great advice. My guest today has been Alison Coffin of Memorial University.
Thank you.